What's going on everyone, Tanner here, and today we're going to do a terrarium update. I know it's been a little while since we've done one, but we just passed the 2-year mark on the native terrarium from How to Terrarium episode 3. As such, I figured now was the perfect time to do the update. Before we get into the update though, I want to give you some history on this terrarium so that you have a better idea of what's going on today. To start, we'll go way back to October 12th, 2016. This is around the time that I started taking YouTube seriously and rebooted the How to Terrarium series. Of course, in episode 3, I showed you how to make a native terrarium. In case you don't know, a native terrarium is made exclusively with plants and other materials that are local to your area, hence the name native. If you want to learn the ins and outs of making a terrarium like this, I'll link the original build up above and several other videos down in the video description. I will say that the commentary wasn't as strong back then, but the information is still extremely solid and relevant. Anyways, when I initially set up the terrarium, I really liked how it looked and it was extremely fun to make. It's worth mentioning that I live in an area with temperate plants. As expected, these plants don't always acclimate well to the environment of a terrarium, so I went into the build with that in mind. Regardless, I was still pretty optimistic about its future. Moving forward to the 1 month mark, everything was starting to take off. There was of course some acclimation die-off with the plants, which is to be expected, especially with this type of terrarium as I expressed earlier. Since I used the soil from outside as the substrate, it was teeming with life, including worms, isopods, and springtails. However, these critters didn't make themselves known until around this time in the terrarium's life. With their advent, I was really excited to see everything taking shape and possibly even more optimistic about the long-term success of this setup. Then moving forward 2 months, the terrarium was looking even better. Most of the plants were well established and the microfauna were really starting to flourish. There were a lot of springtails, some redworms, a few isopods, and the occasional millipede. Although the terrarium was still doing pretty well at this time, problems would soon appear. Jumping ahead a month at the 4 month mark is where things started to go downhill. Shortly before this update, I really started to notice that the worms and isopods were eating the plants to extinction. In an effort to keep this terrarium going, I cleaned it up a bit and added some more plants. The idea was to plant it so heavily that the microfauna couldn't possibly eat it all. Unfortunately, these alterations just didn't work out in my favor. Now we'll fly 8 months into the future to the 1-year update. This update officially ended the first chapter of this terrarium's life. Although the microfauna were still thriving and doing well, all of the plants were pretty much dead. Over the course of time, I observed the isopods and worms eating all of the plants. That said, it was clear that the isopods were simply grazing, while the redworms were doing all of the real damage. In effect, they turned this terrarium into a barren landscape. Perhaps if I would have let the terrarium sit without influence long enough, the plants would have grown back. I wasn't about to sit around and wait though, I wanted to take matters into my own hands. So a few weeks later, I decided to redo the terrarium. I'll link a video on that up above in case you're curious to see the entire process in detail. To recap, I took all of the components out of the jar and cleaned it. Then I reassembled the terrarium using all of the same materials as before, since everything was healthy and well established. I kept all of the same substrate, rocks, wood, and even the microfauna. As you could probably tell, my goal was not to completely redo the terrarium from scratch, but rather to take a second try at what I had already started. That said, I did go outside to obtain new materials including plants and leaf litter. These were then prepared and added into the setup. My goal this time around was to feed the critters with leaf litter to deter them from eating the plants. I'm proud to say that this solution appeared to have worked, although the terrarium looks way different now than it did a year ago. It's looking pretty good, right? Well, let's do maintenance and then we'll circle back and talk about some of the things that you just saw. Upon opening the jar, the first thing that we're greeted by is a beautiful rattlesnake fern and some sphagnum moss. The funny thing is that I have no idea where the fern came from. I don't remember stocking the terrarium with one, and I definitely didn't see one while reviewing all of the footage this past week. So chances are that it was mixed in with some of the mosses and eventually became the plant that you're seeing here. There's also a little isopod hiding out on this piece of driftwood. I started by combing through the fern and removing any of the noticeable dead pieces. Then I removed all of the sphagnum moss. I wasn't too crazy about it growing up through the fern, and I think it would look better elsewhere. Also, it's worth mentioning that this moss has been around since whenever I first made the terrarium, so to my knowledge, it's one of the only remaining original plants. With the sphagnum moss out of the way, I proceeded to remove a large patch of dead pillow moss. At this point it was just taking up space, and there's no guarantee that it would even come back. From there I cleaned all of the moss buildup off of the sides of the glass with a dry paper towel. Like I've said in the past, for optimal results in your terrarium, you want to make sure that the glass is clean. At the end of the day, plants want light. If your jar is dusty on the outside, covered by moss or debris on the inside, or some combination of the two, it will likely hinder the longevity of your terrarium. I know that not everybody likes the idea of doing maintenance on a terrarium, but at the very least I recommend cleaning the glass. Oh yeah, and during this process, one of our friends came out to see what all of the commotion was about. Once I got the glass as clean as possible with a paper towel, I went over it again with a cotton ball dipped in dechlorinated water. This will get rid of any of the remaining moss and polish the glass, making it super clean. During this process, I tried my best to carefully work around the fern, but inevitably it got moved around slightly. As such, I went back with my tweezers and made it look proper. At this point the terrarium is in good shape, and although I think it looks good now, it would look even better with some more moss. Here's all of the specimens that I'll be working with today. I'll also be adding some accent elements from one of my hardscape bins. Don't worry, the mosses and all of these were obtained locally as well, so this will still remain a native terrarium through and through. Before adding any of these into the terrarium though, I removed the acorn caps that were currently in place. We'll add them back in just a moment though. I started by placing the fern moss in the background. Then I divided the sphagnum moss and planted it in various locations throughout. From there I added a piece of wood covered in thread moss. I think this will add interest to the landscape, and it's covered in moss. What more could you ask for? All of the other patches of moss were then planted throughout the terrarium in strategic locations. With all of that taken care of, we need to add more leaf litter. Since this terrarium is pretty small, it doesn't make sense to add full-sized leaves. As such, we'll break them up into smaller pieces so that we can retain the sense of scale. Then they are placed throughout the terrarium without intent. I just let them fall wherever they may and adjusted when necessary to create a natural aesthetic. Next, I placed the acorn caps from earlier back into the terrarium along with other accent elements. All of these items help create texture, which in turn aids in creating a natural aesthetic. Plus, these are all items that you would find in nature anyways. We cleaned the jar earlier, so we might as well go and clean the lid as well. Since the terrarium was open for about a half hour during maintenance, we lost some of the moisture. To address this, I went and sprayed some dechlorinated water throughout the terrarium. Now that it's ready to be sealed up, I'll go back with a microfiber cloth and give the inside of the jar a final clean. Finally, the jar was sealed up and the exterior was cleaned with a microfiber cloth to remove any dust. And there you have it, the 2-year update on the native terrarium. I guess if you want to get technical, this could have been considered the 1-year update, but given the history, I think 2 years is more appropriate. In my opinion, the future of this terrarium looks bright. Something worth mentioning is that this terrarium smells great, almost like fresh cut grass. The reason that I say that is that the smell of a terrarium is a good barometer on how it's doing. Each terrarium has its own smell, and if that smell resembles the forest, then that's generally a good indication that your terrarium is doing well and will last long term. Another indication is that other than the mosses we just added, the plants that are in there now have been in there for at least 10 months or so. I guess that's primarily the fern, which is no doubt the star of this terrarium. It's growing really well, and I doubt I would like this one as much if it didn't show up. On that, let me show you something down in the false bottom real quick. As you can see, this area is jam-packed with moss and algae, but that's not at all uncommon for a false bottom using large stones. What I wanted to show you though is that there's a section of liverwort down here, as well as parts of the fern. Isn't that incredible? You may have also noticed that while we were doing maintenance, this terrarium is still teeming with life. That's always a good sign that your terrarium is doing well, and something that makes it more enjoyable. You don't always see them, but when you do, it's a pleasant surprise. There's so much more I could talk about, but I think that's a solid place to conclude. As I said in the beginning of the video, check out the video description. I have a ton of videos on native terrariums down there, and I even have one that shows you how to make a native terrarium for free. If you're looking to make a terrarium and don't want to spend money or aren't sure where to start, I definitely recommend checking that one out. Anyways, I thank you so much for sticking with me on this one. If you enjoyed the video, take a moment and show me some love with a thumbs up. It would mean a lot. On that, I greatly appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time. Peace.